Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the launch of Richard Steyn's new book, Seven Votes, How World War II Changed South Africa Forever. My name is Jennifer Malik. I'm the editor of the reading list, and we are hosting tonight's launch along with Jonathan Ball Publishers, who are the publishers of the book, and Love Books, your favorite local independent bookstore. If you have any questions for Richard or about the book this evening, or about anything he says, or if you want to challenge him, or if you just want him to expand on a point, type your questions as a comment wherever you're watching this video on YouTube or Facebook, and I'll be passing those questions on to Richard during the author Q&A at the end of the launch. So Seven Votes is the book that we are launching this evening. I'll just give you a brief idea of what it's about. If a mere 7 more MPs had voted with Prime Minister JBM Hertzog in favour of neutrality, South Africa's history would be quite different. As Richard recounts so compellingly in Seven Votes, the war's unforeseen consequence was the boost it gave to nationalism, both Afrikaner and African, that went on to transform the country in the second half of the 20th century. The book brings to life an extraordinary cast of characters, including wartime leader Jan Smuts, D.F. Malan and his National Party colleagues, African nationalists from Anton Mbede and A.B. Nkrumah to Walter Sisulu and Nelson Mandela, the influential Indian activists Yusuf Dadoo and Monty Naika, and many others. So if you haven't bought your copy yet, you should really go out and do that ASAP. It's available now in all good bookstores, and you can support your local brick and mortar bookshop by buying your copy from Love Books. And I believe Bill will be signing the copies that are on sale at Love Books. So if you want a signed copy for your bookshelf to look very smart and important, then you can go to Love Books and pick one up there. If you're in Joburg, you can drop by the store to pick up your copy, but they also deliver countrywide for a small fee. So to find out more, you can email orders@lovebooks.co.za, or you can visit their website at lovebooks.co.za. Now, I'm just going to briefly introduce our author and discussant today. Richard Steyn is a graduate of Stellenbosch University. He practiced as a lawyer before switching to journalism. He edited the Natal Witness in Pietermaritzburg from 1975 to 1990 and was a Nieman Fellow at Harvard University in 1985-86 and editor-in-chief of The Star from 1990 to 1995. He served as Standard Bank's Director of Corporate Affairs and Communications from 1996 to 2001 before returning to writing, book reviewing, and publishing. And he's published a few bestsellers so far. The first one is called Jan Smuts, Unafraid of Greatness, and that came out in 2015. And then Churchill and Smuts, The Friendship. And both of those have established a loyal readership for his books. And I'm sure Seven Votes will be no different. In conversation with Richard this evening is Bill Nasson. Bill was born in Cape Town, where he survived schooling and adolescence and was spared the fate of any kind of armed service. He was educated at the universities of Hull, York, and Cambridge, and has held visiting fellowships at Cambridge University, the Australian National University, and the University of Illinois. For many years, he worked at the University of Cape Town, and is now Emeritus Professor at Stellenbosch University. He is the author of quite a few books himself, including the highly acclaimed Abraham Esau's War, the South African War 1899 to 1902, and Britannia's Empire. His most recent books are History Matters, which is a selection of his writing, and Illuminating Lives, biographies of fascinating people from South African history, which he co-edited with Vivian Bixby Smith. And I'm sure the conversation is going to be very interesting and hopefully not too difficult for us mere mortals to follow. Remember, you can ask your questions as a comment on Facebook and YouTube. I'll be passing those on to Richard at the end of the launch, so don't forget to ask anything that takes your fancy, except for things that are not suitable for work. So grab your glass of wine, and I'll hand over to Bill to begin the conversation.
Thanks. Thanks very much, Jennifer. Richard, isn't this this out-of-body period, age of the zombie apocalypse in which we're living now, reminds me a bit of that 1950s British war film Ice Cold in Alex. Remember that? Late 50s.
Yes, I do.
Yes, where this British sort of transport lorry crossing the desert picks up the straggler who turns out to be Major van der Poel of the Union Defence Forces, and was played by Anthony Quayle. I mean, the arch English Tory actor of his time, who, and it's all kind of radios and communication and a little bit, anyway, it's quite a funny moment, really. So, of course, Major van der Poel turns out to be actually Hauptmann, somebody or other, in Rommel's Afrika Korps. So he's a treacherous Afrikaner, which is not unrelated to things we'll be talking about this evening. What a treat it is to be not next to you, but virtually alongside you, to celebrate, and I really mean this, to celebrate another one of your compellingly readable and well-researched books. I mean, I think those of us who are mere minnows in the pond of historical writing can only envy your ability to concentrate, knuckle down, get on with it, and produce books at the rate at which you do, of unvaryingly great quality. So this is really great to be here to celebrate this with you. Perhaps we could start this evening's discussion by maybe just ask you to talk a little bit about the context of the book. I mean, not necessarily about the book itself, but for listeners or viewers who may need to learn that there were not, that the reason why it's called the Second World War is that there was one before that, you know.
Thank you, Bill. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for those of you who are here for tuning in this evening. And Bill, a particular thanks for you. It's a great honor to have you. I mean, you're an distinguished historian of many years. I'm but a late-coming amateur, and but it's delightful to be able to talk to you tonight. This book is about, I'll tell you how it arose. You know, the war vote of 1939 was probably the most dramatic episode in our entire parliamentary history, apart, of course, from the assassination of Dr. Verwoerd. But in terms of parliamentary debates, it was an extraordinary few days. In 1939, South Africa was a dominion within the British Empire, constitutionally bound to support the king in wartime. We had a whites-only parliament, which was actually sovereign. It decided what the country would do, unlike today, where the constitution is sovereign. And so this parliamentary vote had South Africa on tenterhooks. The Prime Minister was the autocratic General Hertzog, who'd been in power for 15 years. In the last 6 years, in uneasy alliance with another autocratic general, Jannie Smuts. And they had formed an alliance because of the economic depression in the 1930s. And each had diametrically opposing views on whether what South Africa's obligations were vis-a-vis Britain. Hertzog did not want to go to war on Britain's side. Smuts initially didn't, but changed his mind. And as war clouds gathered, Hertzog in 1936, I think it was, put a motion before the fusion cabinet that in the event of a war, which was starting to look likely, South Africa would remain neutral. But in 1938, when it became obvious to Smuts, at any rate, what Hitler's true intentions were, Smuts changed his mind and started preparing people for the likelihood, the possibility that South Africa would go to war on the British side. Well, as the war clouds gathered, so did Parliament, and in September of 1939, when Britain declared war on Germany, parliamentarians from all over the country had gathered in Cape Town to take a decision on what South Africa would do. And there were 5 dramatic days of sort of conkling behind the scenes, of going to Parliament, of various votes and so on. But then on the Monday, the motion was put. Hertzog put the motion to the House that South Africa would stay neutral. Smuts proposed an amending motion. That motion carried by 13 votes, and if 7 more MPs had followed the lead of the Prime Minister, only 7, South Africa would not have gone to war against the Nazis. But the outcome of the vote hit South Africa like of all people of all races, like a political earthquake. And the country was never to be the same again. And some dim distant past, I reviewed a book called Favour by the Afrikaner historian Dr. Ad van Wyk. It was available in Afrikaans only, and I remember thinking at the time what a great pity this was, because it deserved an English translation as well, but there wasn't one. And I thought, you know, back of my one day I might rewrite it. And when I was looking for something to write a couple of years ago, I thought, let's go and have another look at that. But what I wanted to do was to take it beyond the war vote and look at what the consequences were of the war vote for the rest of the 1940s until the fall of the Smuts government in 1948. So the drama around the 7 votes is part one of the book, but the rest describes the fallout from the earthquake, how it galvanized the economy. It also galvanized opposition to the wartime government from Afrikaner nationalists, from right-wingers, also van Brandwag. It gave rise to the ANC as a serious force for the first time, the rise of the Youth League, particularly Mandela, Lembedi, Mandela, Tambo, and others. Their role, the Indian community, was galvanized into action, colored intellectuals, particularly in the Cape. And all this was going on within South Africa while Smuts was trying desperately to keep a lid on things and fight a war in Africa and in Italy. So this is essentially about the war in South Africa at home during the 40s while our troops were fighting in Africa and Europe. But it's really about how the war vote gave rise to the two great nationalisms that came together after 1948, Afrikaner nationalism and African nationalism, and sort of set the scene for the fight for power over the next 40 years. So that's, in essence, what the book's about.
Yes, I mean, I think that that opening stage of your book, where you evoke the atmosphere of that narrow, gossamer thin sort of margin about going to war, is particularly compelling, makes a very compelling start to the unfolding story. And I wondered what I mean, it's interesting, I think, for us to talk a little bit maybe now about neutrality, what neutrality might have meant in the context of 1939. I mean, whether neutrality, you know, these things in history about, you know, what might have happened is how long is a piece of string.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, it's a real question. I mean, was neutrality really a viable option for the Union of South Africa?
I don't see how it was, and there's very little actual discussion of this, except criticism of Smuts for going to war with a paper-thin majority. How can you commit a country, you know, to war in Europe with such a slender majority? But what were Smuts's options? South Africa was constitutionally bound. The Royal Navy had the Simonstown Agreement with the Royal Navy. The Royal Navy had been protecting South Africa's coastline for years, and they were certainly not going to let German boats into anywhere near the shores of South Africa. I think if South Africa had remained neutral, I think what might have happened is because shortly after the war vote, Hertzog came back to Parliament when it looked as though Hitler was overrunning Europe. In early 1940, brought a motion to Parliament for South Africa to make peace with Germany. He thought that the best interest of South Africa was to make peace with the eventual winner. And he was defeated again, this time by a slightly larger majority. But can you imagine a year later, when America enters the war, Pearl Harbor, America enters the war, it then becomes obvious who's going to win the war. And here would South Africa have been a member of the Commonwealth who actually signed up to support Hitler. I mean, we were unpopular enough after the war, but imagine if we'd actually supported Hitler in 1940, as the opposition to Smuts wanted to do.
And also,
what do you think?
I don't know, if you think of South Africa's geopolitical position, the sea lanes and where the Cape was.
Absolutely.
And Germany's ideas of Mittel Europa or Mittel Africa, to parallel Mittel Europa. And I mean, it also raises the question of whether in a global war of that kind, as in the First World War, whether anyone could really be technically, meaningfully neutral. I mean, the best story I heard about this was from Wolfgang Monson. And I was at a conference many years ago now, about 25, 30 years ago, on that other war, the First World War, on the Battle of the Somme. And he was driving a beaten up old, he'd driven from Germany in a beaten up old Volvo 144 estate, not a tank, as he told me, this time. And we had a discussion about, I don't know, South Africa and apartheid and sanctions and so on. And I said, oh, well, this reminds me of my earlier years when you used to see lots of Volvos here before they pulled out. And at that point, he jumped on the bonnet. And he was a small man, I mean, really small man, jumped on the bonnet and banged hard on and said, my boy, this is Swedish steel. Don't you know this? We Germans know it's the best. And of course, that was a classic kind of historian's joke, because what he was saying, of course, is what's not, not much of a secret, that the Swedes were supplying Germany with steel during the Second World War. So it's hard to imagine South Africa not being leaned on, or in some way or other, switching their resources to support the Germans. Yeah,
but I mean, apart the moral issue too, we are members of the Commonwealth, we are bound in, we have an constitutional obligation. Smuts is stickler for international law. I don't see how we could have stayed out. And I don't think Smuts has been given enough credit for taking us into the war. He made enough mistakes during the war, but I think we owe him we are extremely fortunate that he won the vote and that we had him as Prime Minister and not Hertzog after that vote.
Yes, and you could say, the cost of actually fighting in the war was quite negligible. I mean, in actual human terms.
Yes,
big war.
And we could afford it because of the gold price.
The gold price, and I mean, there's that level which one needs to think about. Big war, not many dead. I mean, terrible in human terms, but there were about 9,000, my memory said, 9,000 casualties, just over 300,000 people actually volunteered and fought for the war, which gets us on to a later issue about the impact of the war. Yeah, but that, I think, is a big consideration, really.
Yeah.
That it was a war that was mainly a long way off.
Yeah.
No immediate threat to the country as a whole. And you had gold, and you could kind of ride it and come out of it relatively unscathed.
Yeah. Although, as you say, there was a threat from the Germans, Southwest Africa, and Eastern. So that was a good enough reason on its own for being.
And then later, of course, there's that wonderful moment with the Japanese and Madagascar. I mean, which I think you touch on in your book.
Yeah,
where there's that panic in about 1942, I think, about the Japanese moving into the Indian Ocean and using Madagascar as a sort of springboard to to bomb Durban or some such, I mean, it's a kind of, I mean, the war is quite an interesting thing here if you think about it. When the war broke out, there's all this panic about, the Italians in North Africa and East Africa, and their bombers can reach Parkhurst or Houghton or something, and people were building air raid shelters, and it's almost a sort of phony war, which kept going, actually. Yeah.
Bill, but the impression that I have of the 40s, having written the book, and I mean, you know this better than I, is this was a lost opportunity. This was the last chance white South Africa had of making some sort of gesture in the direction of moderate black opinion, like A.B. Zuma, like Z.K. Matthews, like Jordan and Gabani. remember Alan Paton's remark about Z.K. Matthews saying if white South Africa are interested in evolutionary change, they could do a lot worse than embracing the likes of Z.K. Matthews. I mean, the Native Representative Council was regarded in the black community with great respect. It was the only link between black South Africans and the Smuts government. MPs or NRC MPs were regarded with a considerable amount of respect, like white MPs were. But yet the Smuts government persistently kind of used the war as an excuse for keeping the door shut. And that went on and on. And I do feel that the 40s was the last opportunity that there was a chance of bringing about some kind of multiracial democratic dispensation in this country. Would you agree with that?
Well, I think a lot of historians far more eminent than me, I wouldn't include you in that, but far more eminent and far more authoritative than I would agree with you that I think it was a moment of lost opportunity, the 1940s. I was struck. I was reading just a few days ago a piece by Max Hastings, who, like you, but actually better than you, he writes about a book a week these days, I think.
Oh, he's very much better, I can promise you.
And it was about lockdown, the period we lived through, and the Second World War in Britain, and about, VE Day and the bunting coming out and the Spitfires going overhead and Vera Lynn's dying and all of that, actually, evoking what had been Britain's most kind of emotionally, imaginatively powerful war. And he ended up by saying that the 1940s was this kind of engine of possibility, an engine of change, where for many, many countries, you were going through the war and you would emerge with a sense of new possibilities, progressive change. And some of those currents were present in this country.
The currents were present and never went anywhere.
And never went anywhere. Now, was that because, let me ask you this. Was that because of the franchise? That Hastings is talking about, Western European parliamentary democracies like France and Britain and the Netherlands, whatever. You can pick one from, pick one at random. But was that it? Do you think it was...
Yes, I think it was the franchise, but I think also it was partly the conditions that the war had created. It had caused this seismic upheaval in the African reserves, which all flocked to towns, were not planned for, squatter camps, crime rising, and I think there was a white element that rose, in indignation to that, and then you had the returning soldiers.
Exactly, and
I think that came together.
The miners' strike,
and the miners
strike, which
all
I
of
think
that
scared white. Yeah, yes.
But then, Bill, there was that interesting intervention by India and this isn't really much discussed in South Africa.
No, that's right. Actually,
India was about to get its independence from Britain in 1947, just after the war, and it used South Africa very skillfully as a means of getting at the British.
Yes.
And that
kind of proxy,
turned international opinion against South Africa in an extraordinary way.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I couldn't agree with you more. That was very skillful, adroit diplomatic maneuvering around that. Nehru. Yes,
I also wanted to ask you about...
It's almost kind of lost, and it's almost lost, and it's a feature of your book that you rehabilitate that and bring it up to prominence. The India
I think it's being looked at again now, and I think if you read Mrs. Pandit and others, their autobiographies and so on, it's a very interesting period.
Yes, I know. Yes, this period of sort of flux. Yeah.
Bill, the other thing I wanted to ask you about was the Atlantic Charter. The Atlantic Charter in 1941, signed by Roosevelt and Churchill, and it sort of laid down post-war conditions, including the self-determination for people. Now, Roosevelt, I think, thought this was going to bring about the end of colonialism. Churchill thought this didn't apply to the Commonwealth, and nobody really in the Commonwealth.
Yes.
He was worried about India, not about South Africa. But the ANC actually latched onto that as part of their, I think it was Africa Claims or ANC, and also the Bill of Rights. And it seems to me the Atlantic Charter had a much greater impact in South Africa than virtually anywhere else. Was that right?
I think not. Well, I think that's not entirely true, but I think it's substantially true. That the Atlantic Charter was taken very seriously, the idea, and then, of course, what followed, the idea of citizenship rights and so on for the black majority was taken very seriously. It won't be the first or the last. Yes, for the ANC.
To actually set up a commission. Bram Fischer was on that, I think, to actually cover their policy for the next 10, 15 years, actually based on something that happened in the war.
On war.
Another thing that I don't think
the long shadows of the war actually taken very seriously. And all the other ideas, Richard, which emerged during the war. If you think of Smuts and his reform, stillborn as they were, but his reform initiatives in the 1940s, segregation has fallen on evil days and all that stuff. Yeah. But the idea of, health, improving health facilities and having some form of national health service, isn't that funny? Well, funny, but tragic in a way. But
he went on for too long, doesn't he? He went on for too long. He's almost as old as Joe Biden.
Yes,
he was at that stage,
and that's true. And unable to dance.
Sorry, fancy phoning me in the middle of a. Yeah, sorry. Let me put that off.
No. And unlike Joe Biden, unable to do a tepid dance or a lukewarm dance, which I saw him do the other day. But then I think Yanni had more dignity than to prance around in front of an audience. Yes. Yeah. Yeah, that's go on. Yeah. No,
another thing I wanted to ask you.
I should be asking you anyway. Yes.
Well,
yes.
Yeah, I'm more interested in the issues than the.
Yeah. No.
Would Jannie Hofmeyr, in your view, have succeeded Smuts had he lived in 48? I think it was 47.
Well, yeah, it's one of the great might have beens in history. Well, not just this country, I don't know. I mean, had he succeeded, Smuts, had he been in a better condition, this country might have taken another direction in that period.
Yeah, I don't think he would have. I don't think the United Party would have.
I don't know enough about the. I don't know enough about white internal party politics, but
I would have been interested. I think he might have forced a prog breakaway from the UP when he was projected as UP leader. We might have had him, and that might have been really affected the politics of the 50s, because the first time the National Party actually got a majority of votes opposed from seats was in 1958. So if you had an alternative to the United Party was dead by that stage, and it was the death throes. If you had a vigorous opposition earlier, well, things may have turned out very differently.
But presumably by which you don't mean the Liberal Party.
No, I don't. The Liberal Party, I don't think had a price. I think that you had to have a qualified franchise and built in. I don't know what would have emerged, but I think there might have been negotiation.
Yes, I mean there was that great thing about I'm thinking of Salem Alan in the 50s when there was an attempt by someone like Neville Rubin, one of the Natal senators, who asked, pleaded with him to join the Liberal Party, saying your natural home is in the Liberal Party. Join us. Yeah. And Milan writes back and says, actually, I don't want to join the Liberal Party. I'm too busy looking after my sheep, because by that stage he was a sheep farmer in Kimberley. And there's this interesting exchange, and Rubin says, stop ducking the question, bugger the sheep. And then he writes back, all right, if you really want to know it, let me tell you what it is. That you are pushing the franchise issue, and frankly, quote, the Europeans will not accept a common franchise.
Yeah.
But they will accept other things. They will accept other things. He says they will accept other things. They will accept, Europeans will accept, health service, improved education, all kinds of stuff, including a minimum wage and so on, things we continue to debate today. But that's the way forward. And then eventually, and then Milan also says, I don't want to be queuing up along with a lot of poor whites. We've got standard 6. He says that. We've got standard 6. They're poor whites. And that may have something to do with him distancing himself from his own background in Wellington, but that's another story. But it's a class thing, it's a class
thing as well.
Class politics, the thing that's ignored in South African politics so often.
The other theme in the book, or not a theme, but certainly raises, is the position of the Communist Party.
Yes. Yeah.
I'm honestly amazed at that the communists for the last 70 years have got away with what they have done in South Africa. I mean, for those who don't know, they started the war in opposition to the capitalists who were fighting Hitler. Hitler then rats on stock, invades. And all of a sudden, the communists are now going and recruiting people for the SADF. They use the color issue in the most cynical way from the 1920s onwards. And what I want to know is how, because I don't know the answer to this, but the first Black Secretary General of the SACP, or CPSA as it was then, a young man from Natal, as it was then, liquidated in Moscow. Several Jewish communists, in fact, went over to Moscow, were wiped out by Stalin. Stalin had this terrible fear that the Comintern was full of spies, and if he didn't like somebody, he just had them taken out. And yet this never seems to have surfaced in South Africa. And then during the war, I mean, the Communist Party, once it was, towards after the war, really, not during, because they were quite helpful during the war, but after that, switched sides, then provoked labor unrest wherever they could. And it seems to me that their role in South Africa has never really been examined properly. I mean, we've had Stephen Ellis, there've been, and I wonder why. Why did they have such an easy run in the media?
Well, good Lord, yes. I suppose the answer will be given eventually by Tom Lodge, who's been working.
Well, I hope so. I've been waiting for this book.
Who's been working on a history of the Communist Party, and we wait for that, and maybe it will be published by Jonathan Ball, which would be entirely appropriate. I don't know. I mean, it's an extraordinary story of opportunism and duplicity. I mean, slavishly, the history of the Communist Party and that, and beyond, slavishly, it seems to me, Muscovite and Stalinist.
Yeah,
And,
I mean, there was some very decent.
Back the invasion of Hungary in '56. Barely a murmur about that. It's barely a murmur about that. Yeah.
And there were some decent communists like Eddie Roux and others,
of course,
who were all expelled from the party because being too nice, for being too decent.
Yes. No,
and I mean, this has gone on to the present day. I still don't know how the communists are in our government, but they are, and opportunism supreme.
Well, I think you have to put it down to Chinese-made baseball hats, which seem to be de rigueur for communists, and astonishingly Donald Trump as well. At the present time. Yeah, that does seem to be a particularly potent credential these days to wear one of these caps. I don't know. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting during the war because the Communist Party goes from what we know, and then, the pact, and then of course there's a flip-flop, and then of course they are elevated during the course, as they are in other countries.
Yeah.
You know, in the way
Yeah.
that the Soviet Union, understandably, is elevated as part of the great struggle against fascism. And, you know, on the SABC and elsewhere, the communists
Yeah.
get all their airtime along with everyone else. I mean, it's like almost like a lost moment here. You know, that the Soviet Union was alongside South Africa as one of the allies, you know, the great fight for freedom, democracy, etc. Yeah.
And the nationalists, on the other hand, accusing Smuts of being in bed with Stalin.
Yes,
you know,
no,
at the
exactly.
other
There's
end.
that. Actually, it's the other end of that stick, actually. So I don't know where you end up with, you know, Roy Campbell. You know, what is it, that poet Roy Campbell about South Africa known far and wide for politics and little else beside, something like that. If I remember correctly. but I mean, you wrote that in about 1920, 1928, 1930. Not wrong.
Yeah. Yeah.
I know, biltong. I would add biltong. I used to tell students this. If I used it in class, that Roy Campbell thing, I would say, but, you know, he forgot the biltong. And you would get a cheap laugh. You get a cheap laugh. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Anyway, it was certainly a fascinating decade, and you can see it set some of the fissures in place that are we still live with today. The trade union, after the miners' strike, the strength of the trade union movement, the political strength of the trade union movement seems to have developed from that strike onwards. Governments from then on had to deal with the unionists as a political party, a political movement, which is another big change in the 40s.
Yeah. I mean, can I ask you to talk a bit about, I mean, aside from the communists, the sort of fringe left element to which you give, I think, you know, due judicious consideration in your book. And they're often left out, you know, the All Africa Convention and some of these non-communist socialist trots strands, which I think get a fair run in your book, and it's one of the attractive features, I think, because that element is so often left out of histories of this kind.
Yeah. Well, you know, there were the All Africa Convention, Jabava. I mean, there were so many opportunities for whites to say. I mean, this is what I don't understand about Smuts. It didn't take a genius to work out the population ratios 10, 15 years down the line. And I suppose it was simply a matter of practical politics. He had to be elected, had to be re-elected, and knew that if he behaved like Hofmeyr, he wouldn't be there, and that he couldn't contemplate. That's the tragedy of Smuts.
Yes,
I'm sure he would have liked to have done a lot more, but couldn't.
Yeah. So in fact, that's your view, that he was constrained in the way that in the way that he misjudged it. You know, I mean, the Hastings thing I read recently was that, I mean, his argument that there was a general realization during the course of the Second War by electorates that the Second World War was tossing things up and changing things, and things could not go on as they were before. And it lent in the direction of some kind of progressive change, which, as we know, was of a social democratic kind. Like the war was an engine of change. And that in South Africa, it was also an engine of change, but not in the direction it went in Britain or France or even the United States.
But very difficult for a man of 78, given where he'd come from, his war experience is very difficult. And being such a strong leader and so dominant, very difficult for him to change course. And I just think he went on too long. This, in a way, is the sort of
in a way, a bit like Churchill, who misjudged the mood.
Oh, just like Churchill.
Until the men in white coats came to take him away and say, Prime Minister, enough.
And I'm worried that Mr. Biden, if he gets in, is going to do the same. You're too old at 78. I know, I'm damn nearly there myself, and I'm no fit state to run anything.
I'm on the way.
I know, we all are.
Yes, I know. Yes. No, but I think it's it's an interesting thing to reflect on. And I think also the sense of, I don't know, I mean, the sense of, you go on about, historiographical rediscovery of smuts. But there is that sense where it's almost lost. I mean, the magnetic power he had. I mean, I was born in 1952, and I grew up in the 50s with stories from my parents about smuts. All kinds of stories, and the fact that thing, well, I'm sure that of a certain generation that, that this is really much worse now because it's after smuts.
Yeah. Yeah.
And smuts in a way left us alone. Didn't worry with all that cuck. Petty stuff.
Well, I think it's difficult for a modern generation to understand how much he dominated South African politics for that in the 40s, and of course at periods before that. I mean, long before that. Yes, he was an extraordinary man, and of course the 40s. That was the end of the age of the generals too. The 40s. I mean, we'd been run by generals since the Boer War, or since the Union rather.
Yes,
and this
that's true.
Brought an end to the age of generals.
That's another significant factor, isn't it? I mean, that's very interesting, actually, that you have this war period which ends the age of the generals.
Yeah, and then we have the Dominees and the bloody sociologists.
I know.
Who make things much worse.
You think of the US's Eisenhower, after the war, and of course he was a kind of military figure. But it's the end, really. Yeah.
So there we are.
Yes. So what do you think? What do you think the war means now? Which is a question embedded in. I mean, you started talking about this when we started our very fruitful and enjoyable discussion. But if you read this stuff about, I don't know, what the war means for many other countries today, and we know what it means for the Soviet Union. You only have to watch Simon Reeve on the BBC when he did this thing recently, and about you go to the Soviet Union and you visit a village, and there's the anniversary of the end of the Second World War, and 25,000 people walk with photographs of their relatives who died in that war. And Britain, of course, it's VE Day, and the United States, the Stadtstürkel book, The Good War, and Australia, New Zealand, all these countries that had a kind of consensus that the war meant something in common. And you're left wondering about what it all means now.
Yeah, well, that's a huge question. I mean, we've had so many wars. We had all the Xhosa wars, we had the Zulu wars, we had the Anglo-Boer War, the First War. So there were so many. I mean, I suppose it says to us today that two things, the futility of war, but also there are things worth fighting for. And unfortunately, and I'm just in awe of the debt that we owe to our forefathers. My father was away for 6 years, luckily came back. Those who didn't, it was just a generation that were wiped out for doing the right thing. And I think it's important that we continue to hold up that example as a kind of moral inspiration, while at the same time doing everything we can to, jaw is better than war, as Churchill says.
Yes.
Because wars solve absolutely nothing. They simply, build up hatred and prejudices. But there are times when you have to say, look, this is worth fighting for if that's what you're going to do. And I mean, there are examples abound. I won't go into that today. I don't know what the lesson is, but there are many lessons. Another is that war is a place, that time of the 40s was a time for decision making. People took responsibility, they took decisions. There were sometimes the wrong ones. I mean, even Malone, for instance, who I didn't particularly admire, but he would not go the violent route. He said to the Oswald Brandtvogt, this can only be done through Parliament. That's leadership. We're getting very little of that today.
Yes. Yes.
So
Yes.
there are lessons
Yeah.
on both sides.
Yes. I mean, I think that gets back to your sort of one of your opening points about sort of Hertzog's position. I mean, there's that view that, people like Hertzog, Hertzog in particular, who lived through the Anglo-Boer War or South African War, would have seen the First World War. He's not unlike the appeasers like Lord Halifax.
No,
In Britain.
but the extraordinary thing about Hertzog.
So what we want, anything but another war of that kind.
Yeah. Just on that point, the extraordinary thing about Hertzog was that, having been thought of as anti-English all his life, the reason he was thrown out of the National Party was because he stood up for the equal language rights of English speakers against the likes of C.R. Swart, Van der Merwe, and all those others from the Free State. Well, there was a man of principle, even if you didn't agree with all his principles.
Well, yes, I know, yes.
Yeah.
And there was C.R. Swart, who was a Hollywood cowboy. I seem to remember that as a child, actually.
Vaguely.
Hearing that from my father. Oh,
yeah.
The state president, don't forget, he was like a B-movie Hollywood cowboy.
Yeah.
That may or may not, that may be a folk tale, urban myth or some sorts, but yeah. I'm keeping an eye on the time here as I'm allegedly in charge.
Yeah.
So I think this is the point at which I stop rabbiting on. Richard, is this all right?
No, that's fine. There's some listeners who want to comment.
Yes, and then to ask Jennifer to return to the company and then to do what she does. Okay.
Hi, yes. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Well, yes, thanks.
Okay, good. I'd like to start with the question that was actually asked last. I hope no one gets annoyed by that. But I think it kind of relates a little bit to what you've just been saying. I'll read it out. Asunda Molo on Facebook says, do you think our remembrance of World War II is tainted by the fact that certain races' contributions have been overlooked?
Is that to me?
Yes.
Tainted, yes, I think that's absolutely right. It is, we are tainted. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't hold these remembrance services. And also, I think there's a greater acknowledgement today. I mean, we've seen the disaster of the Mendi, those sort of things, which are now being commemorated. And if you go over, this is First World War, if you go over to Delville Wood today, I mean, it's a totally different memorial remembrance than it was under the old, the previous white regime. It recognizes the contribution that South Africans of all colors have made to all the wars. And I think in that sense, it is far more all-encompassing than it was. It's not perfect, but it's no reason to say we shouldn't remember these people.
I think maybe the book you're referring to, well, one of the books you're referring to is Fred Kamalo's Dancing the Death Drill, which is a sort of historical fiction about the
Mendi book. That novel. Yeah, very good book. Wonderful book.
Fantastic book.
Yeah.
So we've got quite a few questions that are framed, as is the want of book launch audiences, in more of a comment. So I'm going to read them out, and maybe you can sort of, if they're not directly a question, they are sort of raising points that people find interesting. But the first one is an actual question. Ronnie Glass. It's a question in two parts, so I'll just flick them up one after the other. Ronnie Glass on YouTube says, apparently in the 1943 election, Smuts won an overwhelming majority. Why was that? And what did and then he says, and why were the Nats so successful then only 5 years later?
Richard. Well, I tell you why he won 43 is because we'd won the war. The war was going in favor of the Allies. And international opinion, or South African opinion, had by then swung. He was riding a wave, and he had a convincing win in 43. But 5 years later, the sort of chickens had come home to roost. The war was over. All these things had happened. The dissatisfaction with lack of housing, shortage of of housing materials, shortages of food. All these grievances. I mean, every war produces an angry electorate. And as I say, by 48, there was enough indignation about the way the country was being run. The other thing Smuts did, he had a very sleepy cabinet. He didn't keep. It wasn't an efficient cabinet at all. And just by the end of the war, everybody felt that this is a tired. Not everybody, but it was widely felt that this is a tired administration. It's time for change. And unfortunately, there were enough people voting on the colour issue that enabled Malone to win Malone didn't think he was going to win, and Smuts didn't think he was going to lose. So it was a very narrow victory, but much had happened in the 5 years since 43, and since Smuts was actually at the peak of his power in 43. Really in command of the country. The war was going well. The economy was going well. Jobs were going well. It was after the war that that there were some of the unpleasant consequences which he had to suffer for. Would you agree, Bill?
Yeah, no, I think I would agree with that. No, I think that's spot on, actually. Yes. So there was that moment, actually, and also the moment where the Oswald Brandtbach, for instance, and those anti-war forces, which we haven't really spoken about in our discussion, there was that sense that, it was all up for Germany, downhill from here.
Yeah.
And that took the wind out of their sails.
That took the wind out of the
out of their sails, actually, yes.
Yeah.
We have another question from Asanda, who says, I haven't read your book yet, but I'm interested in the idea that World War II strengthened opposition to segregation among African, Indian, and colored communities. Could you explain about that, please?
Well, I mean, the segregation had been creeping up in other than white communities since the 20s. But during the war, I suppose it became particularly virulent, not virulent, what's the word I want, vocal in the Indian community, because one of the problems that Smuts had was he needed votes from Natal in particular, and to an extent he needed the votes of people who were very, very anti the Indian encroachment into white business areas, white residential areas. So he had to introduce these pegging acts. There were two series of pegging acts. Against his better judgment, he knew what this would cause internationally, but that the Indians and the Africans then made a kind of common cause politically during those latter years of the war, which then developed in the 50s. So they encouraged each other. Of course, colored intellectuals in the Cape, they were also fomenting anti-government, creeping segregation. And so these forces all were sort of feeding off each other, egging each other on. And as I say, that culminated in white fears, actually, and then the introduction of apartheid as really a sort of, to keep white defenses up, so to speak.
Interesting. Bill, you're nodding.
No, yes, no. I'm assenting and nodding, yes. To
Cool.
the author, yes.
Elizabeth Sideropoulos, and I hope I haven't horribly mispronounced that.
Sideropoulos, yes.
Sideropoulos,
says, an interesting parallel between the Atlantic Charter leading to African claims and Wilson's 14 points, which was instrumental in self-determination calls in parts of the developing world after World War I. Not a question as such, but I don't know if you want to speak a little bit around that idea.
No, I agree. You're absolutely right.
Absolutely,
Because in fact, in the First World War, when Wilson's 14 points, largely drafted by Smuts, I should add, at Versailles at the peace conference, the idea of self-determination that Woodrow Wilson, the American president, was espousing at that time, inspired the National Party of Malone and Hertzog, I think, was there too, but to send a delegation to Versailles
yeah,
to plead for Afrikaner independence.
self-determination. Yes.
And Lloyd George refused to hear them, saying, we've got Smuts and Botha here, or the elected representatives of the union. We can't hear you. But Elizabeth's point is exactly right.
It's very good.
Very interesting parallels.
Yeah, I agree completely. That's kind of forgotten, that the Afrikaner nationalists sent this delegation to Versailles along with Black African nationalists to plead the same case, in effect.
We have a couple of comments from Graham Plint. I'm not sure if you know him. Sometimes people's friends and family comment, but his first comment is an interesting view on Salem Milan and the intersection on race and class.
Over to Bill. He's the expert.
Well, I think that's absolutely, that's a very interesting comment. I think that's actually that's completely true. And a lot of,
when we were in a room, we could have a proper live discussion.
Yes, I mean, Milan didn't write very much, but what he did write about these public political issues, I think opposite, particularly on that about race and class, that clear intersection, and his correspondence with Reuben is fascinating, really, because it really is about weaving those two together. That he doesn't want to line up with poor whites. He doesn't think that poor whites who have standard 6 or standard 7 ought to be voting in elections in the same way that he doesn't think that black people who have standard 6 or 7 should be voting. That you need a more educated, literate, whatever, electorate. And he says, in my lifetime, it's a wonderful line. He says, in my lifetime, I am reconciled and happy to live in a country with a black majority, but not yet. And he writes this in about 1954 or 55, which I think speaks for a wider sensibility. It gets back to some of Richard's earlier points, really, about what comes out of the war. That sense of the idea that the war could be the germination or the engine of some kind of more common society, but that it would be slow and incremental, and it would develop over time until everyone leveling up. It's what Boris Johnson talks about, the great leveling up between North and South in England. So it seems to me it's an interesting kind of earlier parallel that you need to level up the country, but you need time for that.
Yeah.
He goes on to say, Graham Plint goes on to say, the tension between the ex-communists, Eddie Rue, Jock Isakowitz, is that, I don't know how to Rody Arnstein and Monty Berman, and the SACP created interesting dimension to Darragh Hall meeting and the Freedom Charter episode. Just a comment.
He knows more about it than I do.
There's a question that says, how did the war change the UDF soldiers who fought in it? It's gone from a comment to a very specific question.
Well, I think two ways. Some people came back converted to the idea of sort of universal freedom, but because they ran courses during the war, Dr. Ernie Malherbe ran courses to educate South African soldiery, and many came back having been in the war with comrades, alongside people of color, and came back and said, but these people are exactly the same as we are. Well, this was the torch commandos. But then you had others who came back, completely the opposite, confirmed their race prejudices confirmed. So it changed some UDF soldiers, but by no means all of them, not enough of them.
Yeah. That's true. I mean, if you think of the case of Britain, I mean, what it did in Britain was to, in a sense, radicalize middle class soldiers, the officer corps, who came back and then voted Labour in the 45 election. They might previously have been Tory, probably, but they voted Labour, and that was partly that army educational program that had an enormous impact, I think. And swung them behind things like the National Health Service and various other social democratic initiatives. So a little bit of that, yeah, really. So in a sense, I mean, I don't know whether you'd agree with this, Richard, but in a sense, it's almost the sense I have sometimes is that it's not about ideology. It's almost a non-ideological thing. It's about almost, I don't want to sound too boring and academic, but like relational, that you get this with Milan and the Torch Commando, that they're kind of anti-nationalist after 1948. But it's not with a very firm, coherent ideological opposition. That the opposition is about, I don't know, call this, decency or
Yeah.
I don't know, that it's in an odd way or in an unusual way. I think it's a kind of relational politics that we see that comes out of the war.
As regards the UDF, you mean? Just
yes, that
yes,
the
yes,
impact
I think
of
that's
the
right.
war has
I
been
think that's right.
about kind of decency. If we're all
Yeah.
shot to pieces, we're all in the same hospital ward together,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
we should have the same decent lives in common afterwards.
Yeah, agreed.
Yeah.
That's a good question.
So they're not kind of come out of the war left-wing or liberal zealots of any kind.
Exactly. Yeah,
But
just
they
decent.
come out of the just decent somehow.
More humane.
Yes, more humane. Yes.
Interesting. And it's sort of wearing off now, that idea.
Indeed. Yes, that idea. Yes. Yes.
Ronnie Glass says, please comment on even more specific question. Please comment on page 193 of your book, The Ghetto Act, with Sput's land tenure and franchise proposals.
Well, I'd have to go and have a look at page 193. It's a long time since I wrote it. I mean, the Ghetto Act was what I was talking about. It was the Ghetto Act and the Pegging Act, which limited Indian residential and business areas. And there were no franchise proposals. There were franchise proposals for Bill, remind me of this. There were never Indian seats in Parliament, as far as I remember. But there were certainly plans for municipal representation of Indians. So all of this, all these arguments about what kind of political system we need went on during the war. They were never finally resolved because the Nats threw all of them out, when they came into power in 48. But the Ghetto Act was extremely significant, as was the Pegging Act, because it galvanized Indian. I mean, the Indians actually showed the ANC what passive resistance meant. They went to jail. I mean, doctors, lawyers, they actually went to jail. They didn't simply march with placards. They went to jail. And many of the people in the ANC, like Paul Masaka, said, if you want to see an effective opposition to Black Africans, go and look at what the Indians are doing, because they are suffering. We are simply protesting. So that had a great influence. I can't say the Ghetto Act produced any dramatic franchise proposals, but it's certainly that and the Pegging Act and India's taking up of those two acts internationally had an enormous effect on South African politics.
Politics in the 50s. Yeah, no, absolutely. Yes, sure.
And then Malcolm Giffen says, is the book available in the USA yet? If not, when and where will it be? Regards to Richard from another RPHS old boy. You never escaped.
It's available. I think I haven't read it, but I got a nice note from somebody in America who hasn't been out here who had read it. So it must be available in ebooks, I imagine. On
as
Amazon.
far as I can see, it's available as an ebook and as an audiobook, it seems.
Audiobook. Oh, that's
interesting.
I didn't know.
It seems to be listed as an audiobook on Amazon, but it is available as an ebook anyway. So you should be able to get it straight onto your device instantly, wherever you are. And that's all the comments and questions we have. I wanted to ask, I don't mind we were running a little bit over time, but if you have time, I had a question.
Yeah, sure.
Less historical and more about your writing process, because your books, I'm not a historian at all, and I know very little about you know, I'm very much a layperson. I wouldn't even say I was a layperson. I'm one step below that. But your books are very they're easy to read. And I was wondering, how do you find that balance of filling in all the historical detail, but still keeping it pitched at a level that a normal person can read easily?
Well, I sort of lean on people like Bill and others to tell me what they think of the drafts that I do. But, you know, it's got a serious point, Jennifer. I have the one thing that strikes me about historians is and books on history is that the reader is never really taken into account. You know, historians write for other historians, journalists write for other journalists.
I was wondering if your journalistic background helped with that, because I mean, as a
enormously, because you know, so I try to break things up and keep the pace up and make paragraphs identify, you know, separate, tell people what they're going to read, and then make it as accessible as I can, writing in plain English. I'm not going to win any prizes for literary style, but just to make it easy for readers to read history and say, gosh, I found that interesting, rather than, you know, so many old history books don't have any white space, they don't have any crossheads, they just page after page after page of text. And I just think in the modern world, with time being of the essence, the easier you make it for the reader, you know, that's what we ought to be doing. So I try to do that, keep it short and succinct.
But still, I mean, you've got all the info. It's just it's an interesting balance between, you don't want to skimp on historical detail, but you don't want to overload at the same time.
Yeah, I'm sure sometimes I do in the end.
I mean, in a way, you just want to try to learn to where you're learning lightly, not.
Well, that sounds very. I don't. Where am I learning?
I'm unable to wear anything heavily, but I mean, just where you're learning, try to wear it lightly, and
whatever I'm trying to wear.
As you do in your books, really. Yeah.
I don't want to bore people. That's my goal is not to bore people. If I don't bore my readers well, and they finish the book and say that was worth reading, that's all I want to achieve.
A noble goal.
Yes.
But I want to make history interesting to a lay audience. Frankly, that's what I want.
Yeah, no, that's what it is.
There's so much good history around.
You want to write for that mythical thing, a general audience. And if you're a you know, superannuated, aging, arthritic academic like myself, you spent decades reading boring theses, and yours excluded. Whatever you do is not want to do anything like that.
Well, anyway. Yeah, well, keep trying.
Yeah. Finally, Vanessa Ford says, very interesting discussion. Well, very interesting. Thank you. I imagine she means the discussion. Yeah. So, and I agree. And we all scrambled to grab a glass of wine before we started, but we didn't cheers. Yeah. So cheers to you.
Well, cheers.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Well done, Richard. Congratulations once again.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And
thanks, Jennifer. Yeah.
I'd like to give another punt to Love Books. I'm not sure. Some people might have missed the beginning, but Love Books are going to have signed copies of Seven Votes available for sale in the store. They're in Melville and Johannesburg. So if you're in Joburg, you can pop by and support your local independent bookstore. But they also do courier countrywide for a small fee. So if you're not in Joburg, you can also drop them a line at orders@lovebooks.co.za, or you can also visit their website at lovebooks.co.za. The book is available everywhere, but Love Books are our partners for this launch, and we do love Love Books, and we'd love to be there drinking a glass of wine, but we're stuck here behind the screen. But thank you very, very much for a fascinating discussion, Richard, and thank you, Bill, for leading it. I think it flowed very easily for someone who is not a historian to follow, which is me, but at the same time, I think historians probably were very interested as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, and thanks to Jonathan Ball for publishing the book.
Yes.
Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, Bill. And thank you, Love Books.
And thank you, Love Books, which sounds like some Donald Trump emporium, doesn't it?
No,
To
my
go-
local
to go-
bookshop. Don't be rude about
Yeah,
that.
no. To go with his golf courses, Trumps love books. I mean, I think that's.
I think
Thanks,
Kate's going
Bill.
to be
Thank you.
horrified at
Thanks
the
very much.
association.
Cheers. Thank you.
Cheers.
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 Thank you. Cheers.
Good night.
Good night. Thank you.